Hello and welcome to today's webinar. We're very happy you could join us today. My name is Brianna Humphreys and I am the Marketing Manager for K-12 Education Products at Brooks Publishing. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few brief housekeeping items. You will be muted for today's webinar, but if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the questions box. We'll take these questions after the presentation during the Q&A portion of the webinar. For today's presentation, you might want to minimize the GoToWebinar bar on your monitor so you can see more of your screen. You can do that by clicking the orange button with the arrow in the top corner of the control bar. If you need to enlarge the bar again to ask a question, you can just click the orange button again. If you experience any audio issues at any point, you can switch to phone by clicking in the audio section of the webinar panel and using the dial-in information provided. Also, just another note, we are recording today's webinar, so everyone who registered for the event will receive a link to the recording in a follow-up email tomorrow. During today's presentation, Dr. Schonfeld will reference content from his book, The Grieving Student. In this book, Dr. Schonfeld and Ms. Quackenbush guide teachers through a child's experience of grief and loss, illuminate the classroom issues that grieving may trigger, and empower teachers to undertake the rewarding job of reaching and helping their students. With this how-to guide, one of the most delicate issues an educator will encounter, teachers will give students the support they need to cope with grief and work their way back to full participation in academic and social life. To learn more about this book, you can visit the web address shown on your screen. I am happy to announce that Brooks will be giving away 3 copies of The Grieving Student today. Winners will be randomly selected from today's live attendees and notified by email after the webinar. So today's webinar is on supporting the grieving student during the pandemic. We're happy to have Dr. David Schonfeld, and later we'll introduce Ms. Marcia Quackenbush here with us today to cover this important topic. Dr. David Schonfeld established and directs the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement located at the Children's Hospital in Los Angeles. For more than 30 years, he has provided consultation and training on school crisis and pediatric bereavement in the aftermath of a number of school crisis events and disasters within the United States and abroad. Dr. Schonfeld has authored more than 150 scholarly articles, book chapters, and books, including The Grieving Student, and has given more than 1,000 presentations on the topic of pediatric bereavement and crisis. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over the controls to Dr. Schonfeld, and thank you so much for being with us here today.
All right. Well, thank you. And if you could just advance the first slide. Now, loss from bereavement was common in the lives of children even prior to this pandemic. The vast majority of children, about 9 out of 10 in the United States, experience the death of a close family member or friend, and 1 out of 20 children experience the death of a parent. This high frequency of loss for children is contrasted by the limited preparedness of classroom educators and other school staff to support these grieving students. In a survey done of educators, 93% of classroom educators said they had never received any training in how to support a grieving student at any point in their career. This lack of training was the primary reason educators reported they often don't provide support that they think is important to their grieving students. So let me talk briefly first about the role that schools can play to support grieving students in general, and then I'm going to turn to the unique challenges of supporting grieving students during a pandemic and open it to questions. So if you can go to the next slide. Let me start by going over what schools can do to support grieving students. First, it's important to acknowledge the loss. A common myth is that talking to children about their loss will upset them. But when you ask children about how they're feeling after the death of someone close to them, the upset that you see is not due to the question, but rather to the loss. Your question only invites them to communicate their distress. A related myth is that if you don't know what to say, it's better to say nothing. But saying nothing is actually the worst thing to say to grieving students. It communicates that adults are unaware of what's happened or the impact it has on these students, or unable or simply unwilling to be of help. It leaves children to grieve alone. Schools can provide a supportive environment instead to grieving students. This doesn't require that classroom educators provide bereavement counseling, but rather that they provide an empathic presence and just a supportive presence. Schools are actually well suited to provide this support over time. Children don't get over the death of someone close to them in a finite time period. In fact, many children find that the second year after a death of someone very close to them can actually be harder than the first year. In part, this is because people generally have altered expectations of what things will be like during the first year. They don't expect to enjoy the first Thanksgiving or other holiday and anticipate that they'll be sad on their birthday. There is typically an outpouring of support and assistance during those times. By the second year, the support is generally far less, and children have to confront the reality that holidays, birthdays, and other special occasions often remain sad, and that their grief persists, yet they find they need to address this often without support. Schools can also provide practical advice, such as related to supporting children around participation in wakes, funerals, and other rituals that help children cope with their loss. Schools can also make families aware of community resources, such as childhood bereavement centers and camps, and can offer bereavement support groups or individual counseling in school. Educators can also proactively provide academic supports. Anticipating that grieving children will often have some degree of difficulty meeting academic expectations, at least in the short term. They can also warn children that they may experience grief triggers, unanticipated reminders of their loss that may cause a temporary resurgence of their grief, and discuss how these can be handled during class so as not to overwhelm the students. Teachers can and should try to minimize these triggers. For example, if a teacher is going to conduct an activity around Father's Day, such as having the children write a letter or poem, the teacher can introduce the activity by acknowledging that some children may not have a father who is currently alive or living with them, and invite these students to complete the activity based on their memory of their father, or to select another man in their life who has been important. Schools can also provide support during times of transition, such as a change in grade or school, or at the time of graduation from high school. And lastly, if you can advance to the next slide, educators can talk with peers. Most children want to help their friends, but often have limited experience supporting a friend who is grieving. They may make insensitive comments, ask repetitive or detailed questions about the death, or even tease the grieving peer. In one study of children ages 6 to 15 who had experienced the death of a parent, 20% reported that they had experienced direct, raw taunting about their loss. Peers may also distance themselves from the grieving child to cope with their own anxieties or discomfort. Educators can help students develop skills to support a peer who is grieving by correcting misinformation and misunderstandings and helping students understand how to be supportive of their peer. Advance to the next slide. Teachers can review, for example, practical advice on what to say and what not to say to a grieving student, which we have summarized on a tip card. As one example, people should reconsider statements that begin with "at least," such as "at least you still have another brother," or "at least you were able to spend the holidays together." When children are acutely grieving, it is helpful for them to express their distress honestly and openly. But others may find this distress difficult to witness. They may then attempt to cheer up the grieving individual, in large part because they don't want to experience the grieving student's distress. But this isn't generally helpful to the individual who's grieving. Now, all of these same supports can and should be provided for grieving students during the current pandemic, whether they are grieving a death caused by COVID-19 or a death from another cause that happens during the pandemic. Let me now turn to some of the unique challenges of supporting grieving students during the pandemic and some resources from the Coalition to Support Grieving Students that may be used to address these challenges. And then I will, at the end of the presentation, introduce the Coalition and its resources and let you know where you can download these guidelines. If you advance to the next slide. After the death of someone close, children often become more concerned about their health and that of others they care about. In the setting of a pandemic, there's already often extreme concerns about personal health and that of others. The ability to reassure children that others close to them are healthy and not at risk of dying becomes challenging, even if the initial death was unrelated to the pandemic or even to an infectious disease. It becomes important, therefore, to help children deal with their fears and concerns about the pandemic, in addition to any grief they may be experiencing about a personal loss. The COVID-19 Pandemic Resources webpage on the Coalition website includes presentations for educators, parents, and other professionals on how to talk to and support children during the pandemic. Here you will also find select guidance materials, as well as links to the COVID-19 resource pages of other school professional organizations that are members of the Coalition. This information will help address children's anxiety related to the pandemic, whether they are grieving a personal loss or simply worried about the deaths they see reported in the media. Social distancing measures, including lengthy school closures, increases the social isolation generally experienced by grieving children, and it makes it difficult for schools to provide support using traditional means. While this is certainly true, it is also true that schools often do provide meaningful support to grieving students when deaths occur during summer vacations and holiday breaks, using phone, email, and the internet. And the support provided to parents, guardians, and other family members is generally not delivered in person, even outside of the context of a pandemic. These same strategies can be used during a pandemic when school closures are required, and they're outlined in the coalition materials. Many children's bereavement programs across the country are quickly adapting to the pandemic by providing virtual groups and/or individual support. You can contact the organizations in your area to see how they can assist. Check the National Bereavement Resource Guide, a state-by-state bereavement listing that was compiled by the New York Life and Aluna for a list of bereavement organizations in your state to identify local support for bereaved children and their families. And that link will be found in the guidance document. Secondary losses become even more of an issue. After the death of a close family member or friend, children need not only to cope with the loss of the person that died, but also the loss of everything that person did or could have done for them. During a pandemic that requires social distancing and school closures, the magnitude and importance of these secondary losses may be accentuated. Children who live alone with one or both parents may find acute challenges to meeting even basic needs, such as obtaining food, preparing meals, or providing supervision during the day and evening when only one parent is in the home, especially when that parent is grieving and feeling overwhelmed by the pandemic as well. The usual outpouring of assistance, support, and companionship that would normally be provided by extended family, friends, neighbors, and members of the school community in the immediate aftermath of a death may not occur. Funerals may need to be postponed, and family and friends unable to visit. The coalition module on secondary and cumulative losses addresses this challenge. Family members may also be overwhelmed by the pandemic in addition to their own grief. Surviving parents not only have to deal with their own grief, but they have to deal with the impact of the pandemic. Worries about their own health and others they care about and for, such as parents, financial implications, practical concerns such as how to obtain food and needed services, all while caring for their grieving children. Extended family and friends are likely to be preoccupied with the pandemic and meeting the needs of their own family. The role of school professionals becomes even more important in this context. Resources for meeting basic needs are often the first component of mental health services in the aftermath of a crisis. Go to the next slide. Children may experience more than one personal loss, and deaths of students and staff may impact the entire school community. As the number of deaths increase in the country, children may experience more than one loss. Especially early on in the pandemic, the deaths may cluster due to the nature of spread of the virus, as has been occurring in cities across the country. The grief children experience from multiple losses can be particularly overwhelming and is addressed in the module on secondary and cumulative loss. The death of a student or school staff member can have a profound effect on the entire school community, with virtually everyone impacted to some degree. And the module on death and school crisis covers unique considerations to consider when this occurs. Now, some children's grief may not actually be related to a loss due to death. For some children who don't experience the death of someone they know, they may still have to cope with separation from loved ones, such as due to hospitalization, quarantine, travel restrictions, or the inability to visit older relatives or friends. They may also grieve their inability to celebrate their graduation, their birthday, or special holidays. Transitions, such as from high school to college, or from middle school to high school, may be particularly challenging during a pandemic. The website for the coalition has a guidance document addressing these other losses, which are referred to as ambiguous loss. The module Coordinating Services and Supporting Transitions discusses how to support grieving students as they transition to new grades and schools. Grieving students often experience at least temporary academic difficulties, and so do children during a crisis. As schools transition rapidly to online learning in the context of an evolving pandemic, many children may find it hard to focus and are experiencing academic challenges. Many educators themselves are likely uncomfortable with abrupt shifts to remote and distance engagement approaches, changing expectations for instruction, and lost connections with students and colleagues. Appropriate standards for graduation and grading may not yet have been established by school administrators. The module's impact on learning and grief triggers offer important insights and recommendations that are relevant for all students during a pandemic, whether or not they are grieving. Supporting grieving students can be difficult even in the best of times, and this is not the best of times. This is particularly difficult but critical time for educators to maintain their professional self-care. Some of the ways school professionals meet their self-care needs is through the community of professionals within the school, but that requires more effort due to social distancing. The impact of this pandemic may be longer than perhaps most of us are prepared to accept. It's critical to invest in professional self-care now, and the module Professional Self-Care on the Coalition website offers some suggestions for strategies for professional self-care. If you advance to the next slide. The Coalition to Support Grieving Students that I've alluded to is a unique collaboration of the leading professional organizations representing classroom educators, including teachers, paraprofessionals, and other instructional staff, principals, assistant principals, superintendents, school board members, and central office staff, student support personnel, including school counselors, nurses, psychologists, and social workers, and other school professionals who have come together with a common conviction. Grieving students need the support and care of the school community. This slide lists the founding members of the coalition, although at this point we are up to over 95 members in the coalition. If you advance to the next slide. This coalition created a free school practitioner-oriented website, grievingstudents.org, that houses over 20 video-based training modules on topics ranging from how to talk with grieving students to responding to a school crisis event. Module summaries, handouts, reference materials, and guidance documents providing step-by-step practical advice are available for free download and endorsed by all the members of the coalition. The site also has free resources for parents and other caring adults, if you advance to the next slide, such as this booklet, After a Loved One Dies, which is available for free downloads in English, Spanish, and Japanese. The banner at the top of the landing page for the coalition will take you to the COVID-19 Pandemic Response Resources page. There you will find a guidance document on supporting grieving students during the pandemic, as well as presentations for educators and parents on talking to and supporting children during the pandemic, and links to COVID-19 pandemic resources of other school professional organizations. For those seeking additional information on how best to support grieving students, or prefer a book that summarizes practical advice on how to support grieving students and offers examples from our personal experience, we would like to refer you to the Grieving Student and Teacher's Guide from Brooks Publishing. Marcia Quackenbush is my co-author for both the book and for many of the materials on the Coalition website, and she's joined me today to answer your questions. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to people to ask questions.
Thank you so much, David. We are getting a lot of questions right now. So I'm just reading through a few of them at the moment. One person has asked if you could share some ideas on how to address the grieving that senior students are having due to leaving school unexpectedly and not having their graduation closure and from being away from their friends. Is there any specific tips and insight you can provide?
Sure. Well, to be quite honest, grief during the transition from high school to college is often quite difficult, even outside the context of the pandemic. Children who go to college after they've lost a family member, for example, or a close friend, may find that they feel out of place in the college setting. A lot of children there are trying to get to know each other and to have fun, and they may not feel like that really resonates with them given their recent loss. And they're disconnected from the supports that they've had in their family and in their community, including the school, that may have helped them cope with this. So we always talk about that it's important to try and provide additional support to grieving students who are making that transition. Now, during a pandemic such as this, children don't even have the opportunity to graduate or to say goodbye. So we're recommending that schools explore techniques for virtual graduation and for making sure that they continue the community that's part of the school through virtual means. And I'm also suggesting that schools reassure children that although they may not have a formal in-person graduation in the same way they would have, that they will recognize the importance of coming back at some point, whether it's in 6 months, during a holiday break, or in the summer, even a year later, if that's what's required, so that students can get back together again and see their friends and peers for one more time at least, and know that they will, and they still are, part of the same class, even though they didn't go through the graduation ceremony. I don't know, Marcia, if you have anything else you want to add.
I think one of the things that's also very striking is just something that helps in a crisis or with anxiety is to have something concrete to focus on. And a lot of students don't have that. It's not clear their colleges will even be open. And so I don't have a response to that particularly, but to the extent that I think we can find concrete areas to focus on where we are actually doing something constructive for ourselves or our community, that helps with some of this broader anxiety that we have very little control over.
And that's an excellent point. Part of what I've been telling people, they keep asking, how do we get ready for when we reopen? And my answer is, the way it works in a crisis is you often don't know what will happen until it happens. And as much as we'd like to have that certainty, we don't. And so the other point that you made that's really important is that although we can't tell them when they're going to be able to go back to school or when they're going to find out if their college is going to open their dorms, we can give them some structure now, like what time dinner is going to be tonight, or when they can speak with their grandmother by phone. So I think we have to do what we can do and provide the structure and the continuity that we're able to provide, and then somehow just sit with that discomfort that we really can't answer a lot of the questions that we all have. But that doesn't mean we can't talk, and it doesn't mean we can't share some information.
A lot of really great points in there, David and Marcia. Thank you for that. Another question we've received kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum is, do you have any supports or resources available for supporting grief for very young children, say under the age of 5?
Yeah, in the book, we talk about the fact that children need to understand basic concepts about what death means. And I think that when you look at that, it gives you some framework for how to talk to children about a death that's happened, to make sure that they understand it. Generally, those concepts are learned by about 5 to 7 years of age, but with education and also personal experience, children can learn those concepts at very young ages. I've worked with children even below 2 years of age that can understand it, but they need explanations when they're that young. We also need to recognize that even infants and toddlers can sense when something bad has happened, even if they don't fully understand it. And so making sure that you provide consistency, that you provide support, that you provide nurturing is particularly important with these children when they've experienced a loss. And Marcia, do you want to mention something else? Or
I wanted to say also that you've mentioned several times the website resources. There is a handout there that goes over those 4 concepts, and those are actually pretty useful to be familiar with, even with older children and adolescents. So I highly recommend checking out the resources there.
Yeah, and just to add some more specifics to it, a lot of times people question what children at very young ages can understand, and often don't want to start that conversation with children until they consider them older or more able to comprehend this. One of the examples I often use is that we start talking about death at very young ages with children. Generally in the second half of the first year of life, infants start to learn object permanence, so that when something is out of sight, it isn't literally out of mind anymore. They can remember it. So they start playing peekaboo. And that is considered one of the first games about death. And it's played in every culture in the world at the same developmental level. And actually, peekaboo translates from Old English to alive or dead. And it's really a child who has now realized that things that are out of sight continue to exist, and they start to worry that they may no longer exist or that they may die. So we have these conversations with children through play, starting in the first year of life, And you will see that children do struggle to understand and accept these concepts. So it's a great question. It's never too early to help a child who is grieving. And it's never too early to start even conversations about that, even outside the context of a personal loss.
Thank you for that response. Another question that we've received is, what is the best way to address students and families who have experienced the death of a loved one due to COVID-19?
I think you use a lot of the same strategies that I talked about you do in general. I think first off, you reach out to them. It takes actively reaching out at this point because you won't just run into them at school. So whether it's a phone call or an email message, to let them know that you've heard of what's happened, that you want to provide support and assistance, and that you're sorry that it's occurred, and that you're there for them if they wish to talk. I've had conversations with some schools that are actually trying to figure out protocols because they've had, say, a death of a parent of a student, or one of the schools contacted me, they had a death of a student by an accident that happened. They were on an ATV and they were killed. And they're trying to figure out now how to notify the peers and as well as their parents and provide some additional support. So I think you follow the same strategies of reaching out, talking with them, helping them with the academic work that may be particularly challenging during the pandemic when they're socially distanced, and then seeing if you can connect them with other resources such as children's bereavement centers, who can provide some additional support, and maybe speak with your school mental health provider, such as a social worker, that may be able to help direct them to make sure that they're getting the basics supports and needs that may be more challenging, like finding food or being able to attend to some of their other basic needs during the pandemic. And Marcia, if you have any.
The thing I also think of is providing support to parents. The same kind of guidance you're talking about today, David, to help parents understand how to talk with their children about these losses. And I think the most important thing to me is to recognize children have these feelings, they have deep feelings, and the most important thing any of us can do is be there to listen to them honestly, not to tell them to push their feelings away, but to say, what are you feeling? And teachers and other educators play such an important role to help parents at this time. Parents don't know what to do. And one of the points we make in the book is often families come to educators before they go to mental health professionals or pediatricians. So as educators, you play a very important role in being able to support parents in talking with their children and creating the space for them to talk about, for children to talk about what they're feeling. And we can't completely predict that. So those open-ended questions are a really important part of it.
And I would just underscore that a lot of times teachers and other school professionals are reluctant to enter into this because they say, I don't know how to make this better. But the point is, when you're supporting a grieving child in any situation, your goal is not to make them happy. Your goal is not to make them not be upset about it. Your goal is to help them cope with their distress. So as long as you enter into it understanding what your role is and what is a reasonable expectation, then I think you can really give a vast amount of support, even with a small amount of effort. Even just contacting them, letting them know you care in the midst of all of this can mean so much to a child and to their family.
Thank you for that. I do want to be mindful of our time, but if it's okay, I will ask one last question that we've received. So this asker is saying that they've had a lot of experience recently with parents, with children who have lost parents through child protective services, and that these children in particular are having regressive and aggressive behaviors in their foster and adoptive families. So are there any strategies that we may be able to provide to professionals who are experiencing these kinds of issues?
Well, I mean, children who are in protective services prior to the pandemic obviously just have a wide range of stressors. They've already experienced some degree of loss. would place them in protective services is probably related to some degree of neglect or trauma, which is also an additional stressor for the child. And then they're dealing with the pandemic and being unsure of what may happen to them in the future in terms of their placement, and probably less communication with family and friends than they would have if there was not a pandemic. So you should expect in those situations that children will experience distress, and they may show that through their behavior, as well as in some of that as regressive behavior or aggressive behavior. I think what you need to do in those situations is try and create a safe space and a supportive space for children. So that means if they're violent or they're hurting themselves in some way, you need to set a limit on that. You need to say, I understand, or I can only begin to understand how upset you are, but you can't hit me, because I want to be sure that we're all feeling safe. So you just gently place limits on some of the most regressed and destructive behavior, while allowing them to be distressed and trying to help them figure out coping mechanisms and strategies. And I think we also have to just set realistic expectations for what academic progress and what accomplishments kids can have during this period. They may need to, act a little less mature or look for things that were comforting to them at a younger age. So, you might have a child who's 7 or 8 who wants to just cuddle and read a book more, and that's okay. I think a certain amount of regression, if it allows them to cope effectively and doesn't hurt them, is fine. And so this isn't the time to make, dramatic improvements in their developmental milestones. It's a time to support kids during distress and celebrate what little accomplishments they are able to make despite really enormous challenges. What I'm telling people is, at this point, if we teach kids to cope with this, we've taught them a lifelong lesson that, quite frankly, is more important than anything we would otherwise teach in school. So helping kids learn coping and adaptation, particularly children as this person described, who already have so much to deal with, if we can give them some progress in coping with any of those stressors, we've really done a lot for them. Marcia, I don't know if you want to end with something.
No, I totally agree. And I was thinking regression. I think many of us are regressing right now, with seeking comfort and finding ways to comfort ourselves without the connections that we're so accustomed to with family and friends. And my friends with children who are in perfectly safe, normal, healthy families are having similar issues. Not as extreme as the students who would be in foster care or in protective services, but it is kind of how we're coping.
So. And I think we have to recognize that we are not at our best either. And so as a result, there are going to be times where we lose our temper, where we become frustrated, where we become anxious. And we have to be patient, not only with our children, but patient with our spouses and friends, and patient with ourselves, and recognize that this is just a hard time. And learning that patience is, again, a really great skill, and I think goes a long way in terms of professional and personal self-care.
Great, thank you so much for that response. Just in the interest of time, I am going to move forward at this point, but thank you to everyone who submitted questions today, and thank you very much to David and Marcia for your answers to these questions. I do want to remind everyone that if you're interested in learning more about David and Marcia's book, The Grieving Student, be sure to visit the web address listed on your screen. That's bit.ly/grieving-student. You can learn more about the strategies that David presented a bit earlier today. And also from Brooks Publishing, we are offering a 20% discount that's valid on most of our products on our website. So if you are interested in David's book or anything else, be sure to use the promotion code Coffee Talk that's listed on your screen. That's valid through the end of June. So feel free to take advantage of that offer as well. And if you're looking for more professional development opportunities over the coming weeks, check out the Brooks Publishing website. There is an address listed on your screen here as well. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we are hosting ongoing coffee chats with our authors on a variety of topics. So check in regularly and feel free to sign up for more webinar opportunities. And if you're looking for additional COVID-19 resources on the Books Publishing website, we do have a variety of recommended reading, downloadable resources, and professional development webinars available. So feel free to bookmark that page as well if you're looking for additional resources. So thank you so much to everyone today for attending. We appreciate you spending your time with us to learn more about supporting grieving students during these unprecedented times. And once again, thank you so much to David Schonfeld and Marcia Quackenbush for this great webinar today.
Thank you.
Okay.